We don't know what happened there. It happened to everybody. So
Everything all good, Matt?
it happened to the whole company. Everybody on our Slack channel, every single room just got canceled somehow. So we're not the only ones. It wasn't me, I promise.
Whew.
Okay.
All of us were on the Slack channel, and it happened. I was like, oh my gosh, what did I just click? And then everybody wrote that all the rooms got kicked off. So we don't know what just happened. We're good to go now. Sorry.
All right.
Cool.
Okay.
You guys rock and roll.
I was just furiously emailing Mike. I'm like, oh my God.
What happened? Was it me?
Well, usually it's me when these things happen. So I'm glad to know it wasn't. All right. Let's try this again. Okie doke.
So I wasn't the only one who was kicked off?
No, we're good.
No.
I just spoke. Andy said he had to relaunch for the whole conference because something happened. So every single room got kicked off. So we're all back. Don't worry about it. It won't happen again.
As the Quakers say, we're going to hold Taylor Miller in the light today. Make sure.
That's right.
Let this be the biggest problem of the next few days. It's okay. All right. Well, do we want to, are folks still coming in, you think, Matt? Or, and Matt, do you want to make us co-host again just in case something happens and Mike, we can share?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Haley, whenever you want to get started with Act 48 thing.
Yeah, so why don't we just quickly, I know also we've got a bunch of veterans here, but just as a reminder, if you need Act 48 credits on this session, you can complete the Act 48 request form, which is available at the bottom of the conference landing page. And remember to complete the session evaluation at the conclusion of today's session. Also on that same landing page, it's at the bottom, and then the main conference survey to be completed at the end of the conference on Tuesday. Don't forget to do that. So thank you from CPC. That's their little public service announcement this morning. So great. Well, thank you for coming to the first session of this exciting PACAC virtual conference. I guess we'll get started.
Yeah, and if you guys are here for counseling neurodiverse students, you are in the right session. Happy that you are here to join us. I know that you had lots of other choices this morning, so we're super pumped. We were looking at the plenary for the morning. We were like, who's going to come to our session? But we got a lot of you here, so that's super exciting. So I'm going to share my screen, and we can jump right into this presentation.
And again, as Mike and I present, if you want to use the chat box to share your impressions, questions, motivations for why you're here, we will, while one's talking, the other one will kind of moderate. And we're happy to have Matt Hale from Revolution Prep helping us today as well.
Yeah, and so I'm Mike Dunn. If I haven't met you before, it's good to see you here. I work at AIM Academy. We're a small independent school just outside of Philly. We serve about 380 students, grades 1 through 12, and all of our students have some form of a language-based learning disability, and we're going to get into a little bit about what that means here in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Mike, if you want to go to the next slide, that'd be awesome. Good morning. Also, I'm Hallie Charlone, and I work at Delaware Valley Friends School, affectionately known now as DV Friends. And we also very similar to AIM Academy in that we serve students that have specific learning disabilities. Please know that something that we do ourselves is we really use differences and disabilities interchangeably. So I just putting it out there in terms of if anyone has any trigger warnings in terms of disability or difference, it's just something that we use interchangeably in our world, kind of abbreviated to LD is there. Most commonly, the folks that we serve, very again, similar to AIM, are students that have the following conditions, are living with the following challenges that you see on your screen. Typically on IEPs and reevaluations, you'll see specific learning differences, which most commonly are going to be your dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, so reading, written expression, and math disorders, ADHD, executive functioning deficits, auditory processing disorders, expressive receptive disorders, and then oftentimes there's a comorbidity with a lot of the mental health pieces too, anxiety, depression, working memory, and something that Mike and I have seen recently on testing is what's called sluggish cognitive tempo. That is a new one that we've started seeing in recent years. So we have quite a range of students. It's important to note also, and Mike can chime in as well, we typically are not serving students with autism spectrum disorders. That's not typically the primary group that we serve. We wanted to kind of make that point to you as an audience that neurodiversity is a very wide range of conditions. And we wanted to be upfront and disclose we're talking more about the neurodiversity of learning and attentional issues as the primary diagnosis. Is there a comorbidity? Absolutely, sometimes. But from a context of who our schools serve, those are our primary audiences.
Yeah, I would just add that we try to state pretty specifically that we're just not an institution designed to handle some of the behavioral issues that a person on the autism spectrum may be experiencing. And we don't have the support staff in place for those sorts of issues. But similar to what Haley was just saying, AIM serves almost the exact same swath of students as Delaware Valley. Not to say that we are the same school at all. We are very, very different places. And that's sort of interesting when students are considering where they might attend school. But yeah, I think I would share a similar set of information here. I'd also just say that I use the terms differences and disabilities sort of interchangeably as well. So you might hear me refer to them at one point as one and the same or slightly different.
We also want to acknowledge that we have a wealth of resources in the Philadelphia metro area. This is actually the highest concentration of schools that serve students who learn differently in the country, is in the Philadelphia metro area. So just putting it out there, and we also want to recognize that we do both come from independent schools. So some of the things that we get to deal with on a day-to-day basis are very private school-esque. However, we are serving students who learn differently, across the state and across the country with the resources, and we want to make sure that counselors are well equipped to go forth and counsel them. So who is this student group, right? This is a group of students that are in all of our schools, all of our colleges and universities, all the workforces. They are what we like to call the great hiders of the world. These are students who have an invisible disability sometimes, where they can get through, they're doing just fine. There's students who oftentimes will sit in the back of the classroom, can kind of fly under the radar in some regards through elementary, middle, and high school sometimes, but they don't have to. Why should they hide? And so our goal is to help bring them out of that hiding and make sure they can own who they are and be successful.
Our student group is also so much more likely to struggle with things in college that have nothing to do with learning new content. So they might be particularly bright and really love to learn about psychology, right? But mastering how to decode a textbook and organize information from lectures is a serious challenge for them. So therefore, they might experience a pretty distinct difference between their achievement and their ability. So they might say, I love learning psychology, and if you talk to me about psychology, I can tell you about the topic for 3 straight hours, right? But then when it comes to performing on a test, when it comes to managing a project for their psychology class, those are the things that are sort of acting as stumbling blocks for many of our students.
Mm-hmm. And by definition, to have a learning difference or learning disability, there has to be a discrepancy between achievement and ability. We like to say that by nature, these are smart students. That's why there's that difference is what creates that diagnosis, basically. And it's, again, across the country, 1 in 5 students have some kind of diagnosed disability. And quite frankly, I think we're going to be seeing more and more diagnoses as we see the rise in anxiety, as we see that become a clinical piece to things. And these are students who are going to experience anxiety around a lot of transitions. This is time where they've been in high schools, they've been in secondary schools where they've felt supported, where they can get services. And all of a sudden that entire transition, there's the initial general college transition that everyone goes through. Now add on, they have to get their medication filled. They have to navigate, oh, am I allowed to drink? Can I drink with my medication? I don't think I can. How am I going to tell my peers I can't do those things? How am I going to advocate for myself for a professor who might say, I don't believe in dyslexia, which yes, that happens out there.
Right.
It drives Mike and I crazy when we hear those stories, but those are things that now are going to be in their laps. So there's, again, a significant anxiety around transition beyond just the content learning.
We also like to add that many of our students have had their parent or parents or some sort of other family member or advocate acting as their very substantial advocate for much of their learning career. So they may have had that parent involved heavily in IEP meetings, have that parent heavily involved in advocacy work against or with their district. And so that ultimately results in a relationship with the parent or the guardian or the advocate that is really, it can be sort of difficult to kind of separate as the kid goes to college, because the kid is in charge of their own advocacy when they're in college, and the parent can't be there to advocate for them. And so I think that has a lot of really substantial implications for what we do in school with kids in things like IEP meetings or 504 meetings, and how we can get kids involved to get them used to advocating for themselves much earlier, rather than in college when they're just sort of, dumped into a world where they're having to advocate on their own. Oh, I'm first. Okay.
Sure.
So
We color-coded it.
Yeah.
Good little tip there.
So we wanted to put in a couple of myths here about neurodiverse students. One of the biggest myths I encounter, and I'm sure Haley does as well, is that LD students are lazy or just not working hard enough. And one of the best examples I give of this is if you can imagine you pick up a textbook or any sort of book, and it takes you 30 or 45 seconds to read one page of a book. And you get through about 30 or 40 pages and you're pretty tired, so you fall asleep. And it was work. It takes cognitive energy to do that, 30 to 45 seconds of reading per page. And then you hand that same book over to a student who has maybe sluggish cognitive tempo or some other sort of learning difference. And it takes them, let's say, 90 seconds to read one page. They get the same sort of material out of that one page as you do, but it takes them so much longer to read that one page. All of a sudden, they're not able to read 30 pages. They're able to read 10 pages and are exhausted. And it takes them the same amount of time that it takes somebody without that learning difference to read. And I think that there's this stigma attached to students who are actually working very hard, but maybe that hard work isn't seen because what's going on in their brain is very different than what may be going on in a quote unquote neurotypical individual's brain.
And to that note, another myth that I think Mike and I hear a lot is that LD students need to attend special colleges. I think, just to name one that is a big national sponsor of things is Landmark College. Landmark does a wonderful job of serving students. They've got great programs. They sponsor professional development. They do great teacher programs. But that's not the only place where students with neurodiversity attend college. I would be, I put money on that. You could ask any university or college in the country, and there's going to be students who learn differently there, especially, again, with the rise of anxiety and other kind of comorbidity issues that we're going to see here, and attentional difficulties. Students can go anywhere. It's not that an LD student is not as bright. It's a matter of finding the parallel process to support them through the content, the academic and social emotional support, and the general transition to college. So I like to encourage that students can attend anywhere. It's just a matter of their advocacy. With that said, every college, as we know as college counselors, every college is not right for every child. You're not going to send a student who wants to major in, culinary arts to maybe a school that doesn't have any culinary arts program, or vice versa in terms of it. Why would you send a student who wants to major in mechanical engineering to the Culinary Institute of America? Not the right fit, right? So it's not just that LD students have to attend special colleges. It's a matter of finding support within there, both from a specific program as well as general accommodations and support at the university level.
And I'll just build off of that because there are a huge swath of colleges out there that have fee-based comprehensive support service programs. Some very common ones that come to mind might be American University or Hofstra University. Those are fairly common in this area. And I often get the question, can you just tell me the list of the schools that have comprehensive support service programs? And I'm like, sure, but you got to tell me who your student is first, because not every student needs a $3,000 or $5,000 a semester fee-based support service program. every student's accommodation needs are a little bit different. Their learning needs are a little bit different. And so saying that a comprehensive fee-based support program is what every student needs, I feel is fairly irresponsible. And to tell you the truth, there are a lot of students that come from AIM, for example, that might go to, say, Marist. They'll interview at Marist, and the Marist support service people will say, we don't think that our program is quite right for you. And they say, our regular set of accommodations are good for you, but you don't need our $4,000 a semester program. And we'll talk about how to figure out what those programs are a little bit later in the presentation. Oh no.
We're good?
Is this the next one? Yeah, okay.
Are we good? Okay.
Yeah.
So a few things to think about as we look ahead. So we want to break it down to admissions reps from the college side, as well as the high school counselors, and things that we can give you as tips to take on, from today on to be aware of. So a few things that I like to make sure that I communicate to our admissions reps, because one thing I think is kind of our duty as high school-based counselors is to recognize that the admissions reps might change year to year, and that's a normal part of our profession, and to share our knowledge and to make sure that there's well-equipped as we are to help guide students, because I really do think that we're in this kind of collaborative relationship where you at the college side and we at the high school side really work together to support the students. So my biggest tips for admissions reps over the years has been really just know where your office is located. So there's an element of equitable distribution of the resources of just telling all students. So if you have tour guides giving tours, I would never expect a tour guide to know all the nuances of the LD program or the nuances of a disability center unless they use it themselves. But you know what they can do? They can show where it's located on a tour, whether it's virtual or in person. They can talk about who's there. And that creates a sense of, for all students and families, oh, this is where you can go to get the help you need. It might be a student who comes from AIM or Delaware Valley Friends who knows immediately, like, okay, I'm going to go there day one. Or it might be a kid who doesn't realize they needed the extra help until they got to college. And then they realized, wow, this is very different, whether it's from an LD perspective or just a general access issue. College is hard, right? For any student, it's a big transition. So knowing where the disability office is located really does help create an equitable situation for all students. Just knowing if there's an extra fee, I think it is just good advertising and good practice to be able to share with parents, great, here's this program we have. This is free. Our writing center is free, but if you want the add-on, Marist program or SALT program or, High Points Learning Support Program, this is an extra $4,000. Not judging the quality of it right now, but it's important for families to know what they're getting into as they're looking at your services, at your programs. Also, from a general level, knowing what's required. I can't tell you how many times we get the question of, oh, well, is foreign language going to be required? Do I need to take math for this major? I'm not asking an admissions rep or a tour guide to know all the nuances of every major in the university, but if there's a school-wide distribution requirement, you should know that. The same way you would know if there's a freshman writing seminar, you would know if there's a university-wide language requirement. And from an LD perspective, colleges don't have to waive requirements the same way that secondary schools do. So for example, a college can make a student take a foreign language requirement and fail before they're allowed to get a waiver for it. Whereas the high school level, we can kind of waive it from the get-go. So just knowing what's required, whether it's college-wide or major-specific, or at least just where to tell families to find those answers. And building the rapport is really important. So it's important to know, and I know that not every college rep is going to be able to go to every high school, especially now in the age of COVID here. But as you deal with students who learn differently, building that rapport is really important because there are so many differences between our high schools. So Mike and I have mentioned, we're very similar in terms of who we serve, but our high schools are very different, in terms of the culture of our school, how we talk about different things. So knowing rigor, these are students who have had oftentimes school-based trauma. Students who learn differently have come to get to that 11th and 12th grade year from very different places. So having a tour guide, and I'll own up, this was when I was a tour guide in college, this was me. I was like, oh, we do all this work and it was so exciting because look how rigorous we are in college. That's not necessarily a selling point for our families. That might actually be a turnoff because they're going to say, oh, maybe they're not going to support me. So just being aware and cognizant of the messaging that's being sent I think is important for reps to know as they move forward with dealing with neurodiverse students and their parents as well. So in terms of advocacy and disclosure, I think it's important also to remember that once we leave the high school realm, standardization is gone. I think Sigas mentioned a question about conducting an IEP meeting without parents. I think it's important to still involve parents, and someone else can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of legality. I think it's important that also know that Mike and I work at private schools where we don't have to write IEPs, just putting it out there. We do our own specific learning plans. But as long as a child's still in high school, the parent really needs to be present for that. I like to think of the college process as a family decision where, yes, the child's leading it, but behind the scenes, the parent is still there very much. We do talk to parents a lot about documentation and how they're going to pass that off to their child. So when you get to college, that advocacy now falls to the student's lap. So every college is going to have their own documentation guidelines, and Mike's going to speak a lot more about the nuances of those. But those are always going to be on their websites. I tell families, go to the websites, type in disability into the search bar, and it'll tell you exactly what's there, when you need to get reevaluated, what documents need to be there, whether it's from the private evaluators, your school, everything else. Asking students how they learn best, thinking critically about what do you need in your community. The same way we would talk to students about what do they want in a college community, we're going to now add on also, who are your people? Who is going to help you? What kind of teaching style do you enjoy? Is it classes where you're going to be lectured at, or is it classes where you're going to have to read ahead of time, or group work, whatever it is? Activities, food, things that are going to help with easing that transition is going to be important. And I like to drill into our families that, the best fit is not about just getting in, it's staying in. So we have that parallel process. Here's your traditional college admissions search process, but we're also going to talk about support offices. Who are going to be your people? How can you find those people who are going to support you in all facets of your life so that you can do the normal content? And that's going to be important as you go forward as well.
I'll just add two things to this that I think that to Sigas's question about when to get a student involved in the IEP process, I usually suggest to families that as soon as a student goes into high school, they need to be really intrinsically involved in whatever that process looks like. So at our school, we have student-led conferences that start in 9th grade. And the student is given like a pre-conference reflection form on their coursework and on their advocacy skills and on their executive functioning. They reflect on their experience in their classes as early as 9th grade and then bring that into a conference. And then they're given talking points in 9th grade. Then in 10th and 11th grade, they develop those talking points with their advisor's help. So that that aspect of their advocacy is built in directly to our program. So I would say bringing students in as integral parts of the IEP process as early as 9th grade it can be really, really important. And talking as a parent, talking with your kids about how to be a part of that process and not just it being a bunch of, like lawyers and special ed people sitting in a room talking over the kid's head, right? That the kid is actually there, not just to be there, but to act as an important advocate for themselves in that process. I'll add one last thing is that there's two things that I always say that students need to be able to be ready to articulate once they graduate from high school. And that's number one, what the nature of their learning difference is and how that affects their learning in their own words. And then number two, what are the kinds of accommodations they feel like they need and why? And again, in their own words. And I go through like little case study scenarios with parents and students all the time that ask them to practice those things. Because if you can imagine a student's going to end up in front of a disability support office person in college, sit there and the person's going to be like, so why do you need extended time? Tell me about that. And it's not to deny them extended time, it's to understand the depth of their learning difference more. So having them be ready to articulate those things in their words and not IEP language and not, psych ed evaluation language, but just in whatever the student has to say about those things, I think is pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I think we skipped a slide before those two. the counselor tips. I think we might have skipped that one. There we go.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's okay. I just want to quickly jump real back to that before we get into the nuances of the legality piece, which is what Mike was going to talk about next. Just a few quick tips for counselors. I know we have a few counselors on here who talked about wanting to know about 504s. And Mike alluded to a lot of these parts here. So just quickly is thinking about each student as an individual learner, not just a diagnosis. So to Mike's point, talking about why do you need this accommodation? What is it that you're actually the functional need? So we talk a lot about a functional limitation. Those are words you're going to see a lot on documentation pieces. What's the functional limitation to why the student needs accommodation? So knowing that they're more than a diagnosis, but why? What is affecting it? I also want to touch on real quickly, kind of a myth as well as a tip for school counselors we touched on a little bit, is there's no best college for fill in the blank, right? I think Mike and I can both attest, we love to help our colleagues around the country. We feel like this is a really underserved population of students who need extra care sometimes. And we had to learn it too. You know, Mike and I did not come from special education backgrounds. I came from college admissions and then into a neurotypical private high school and then to Delaware Valley Friends. So we had to learn this, so we're happy to share. But one thing that really is important is to, you know, when parents ask, oh, what's the best school for dyslexic students? That's not, no. No.
There's
So
no such thing, right?
There's no such thing. It's knowing about how to support the child in the right environment.
Yeah, I'll add two things on this for tips for counselors are consider asking questions about what support looks like from home. If I'm working with a student that may not be an AIM student, those are some of the very first questions I'm asking. How many hours a night is that student having to work at home to complete their homework? What is a parent's role in that process? Is the parent saying to the student, hey, Mike, go and do your homework right now. I'm going to give you 1 hour and then come check on you. And is that still happening when the student is a junior or a senior? Is the parent still working on helping that student make a calendar and a schedule? Is the parent helping the student eat dinner at the right time? Sort of all of those extra support mechanisms that you may have in place at home. Asking families directly about those things is pretty important. And then to be wary of top schools for LD students list. Again, there's not really a one size fits all. It's a little disappointing that those exist, but they exist for whatever it's worth.
Thank you for going back, Mike. Amy, thank you for your chat there about the accommodations meetings. What you're doing sounds like exactly what the students are going to be asked to do in college. They're going to meet with disability services, get their letter to bring to professors. So it sounds like you're training them very well already.
I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because we can share the slide deck out with you guys, but there's a legal switch that happens with students when they exit high school and enter college. In high school, they're covered by IDEA, and then in college, they're covered by ADA. And a couple really important bullets I covered here with this little table thingy. But I'll say a couple of big takeaways from the table is that there's an emphasis on access in college over the word success, which is an IDEA word versus an ADA word. And that means that modifications for things can happen in high school. So if a student has like 100-question multiple choice test, and that student is unable to complete the 100-question multiple choice test in high school for whatever reason, maybe the teacher's asked to pick out the 60 most important questions and give that to the student. That's just never going to happen in college. The 100-question multiple choice test is going to happen in college regardless of the student's learning difference. The question is, how is the student going to access that, right? So it might be extended time to access that test. It might be testing in a distraction-reduced environment. All of those things are possible, but the test will never change. Similar to projects will never change and deadlines will never change, because the emphasis again is just on how is a student accessing those things, not is the student going to be successful. Because K-12 education in the United States is considered compulsory, we want to make sure that students are being successful in K-12, but because college is optional, there's no guarantee that a student is going to be successful. And again, we'll share this out so you all don't have to read and write all the notes and all those things. And a couple notes about documentation. So once a student graduates from high school and IEP, it doesn't necessarily go away. It can be a useful document, but it's definitely not a binding document as it is when it is in high school. Same thing for a 504, can be useful for securing accommodations for physical disabilities. So if a student has a 504 because they have asthma, let's say, it can be useful for securing, like, let's say, an air conditioner. If the dorm room doesn't have air conditioners, they should also consider a different college. Dorm rooms should have air conditioners. But so the 504 can be useful for securing those types of accommodations. But the real documentation that a student needs when they go to college is a psych ed evaluation, usually within the last 4 years and usually after a student has turned 16. As Haley mentioned earlier, all of the documentation guidelines are typically found on the college's website. So you can just read and see, and parents can read and see. And some colleges are a little bit more lenient than other colleges. We found that, some small colleges are very lenient. They're like, just tell us what you have, bring whatever documentation you have. Some smaller colleges are like, no, you need, an updated evaluation within the last 24 months or something like that. Some big colleges are very welcoming, some big colleges are not. So it doesn't really, there's no like set answer as to who's going to accept what documentation. Sorry, I got to move my little thing out of the way. But we have found that most documentation must include an adult IQ test and a section that includes recommendations for college from the evaluating psychologist. Those are pretty critical in terms of overall usefulness of the documentation when transitioning to college. So I'm having to move my little thing around.
If I could add real quickly also, just because it's a recommendation doesn't mean your student's going to get it. So if you want to move on to the next part there too with accommodations, just because psychologist puts in, oh, the student should have this much extra time, doesn't mean the college has to give it. They can do what they consider to be fair and reasonable. And that's an important thing, I think, to make sure that your families and the students are aware of, that just because it's on there doesn't mean that's what you're going to get. And that it's something that takes a while. So in terms of scheduling testing, oftentimes that takes a few months out to schedule. And whether it's through your district or through a private evaluator, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So really thinking ahead, this is not something that they want to be doing June of after they graduated college or high school. This is something they should be doing earlier. It's also important, I think, to note that this is not something that's used in the admissions process unless it's a specific add-on program. So the admissions office is not reading their psychoeducational evaluation unless it's a separate program. So Mike brought up Marist College earlier. Marist is a really wonderful add-on LD program. They have someone in their disability office reading that part, talking to the admissions office, and they both make their decisions and they talk to one another. So there is time to get the reevaluation report done before they start attending college in the fall. However, it's going to take a little while. And then with the COVID issues we're in right now, some folks are doing telehealth, some are not, some are accepting it, some are not. A lot of nuances. We as the counselors, a lot of times I think of us as the frontal lobe for our families. And I say families because parents sometimes need this as well. We are that executive functioning helper and making sure they have everything sequentially as needed. So quick note about accommodations in college. A few key differences that we like to point out that is going to be very different than their high school experience is that unlimited time is not a thing in college. You're not just going to get, are there colleges that do kind of self-paced take-home exams? Absolutely, but that's for everyone. That's not an accommodation, right? That's a honor code piece. So typically you're going to see 50% or 100% extra time. And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I very rarely even see 100% extra time in college. It's really just 50.
Yeah, 50%.
Even if the child had 100% in high school, the colleges tend to err down to 50. But they're remembering that the deadline is the same. You're not going to get an extension. So helping our students train the executive functioning skill to plan ahead is going to be very important. The next part about testing, oftentimes the students might test in a smaller, maybe the testing center or not in the main classroom. Being wary of using the words distraction-free. there is no such thing as distraction-free testing. It could be distraction reduced. Oftentimes the LD students are their own biggest distraction. So you're only going to get a certain reduction by the external reduction, not for themselves. Transitioning over to having audiobooks or note takers or recorded lectures. Most students have not had to sit in a lecture in high school before, so knowing that there is a separate person who's going to have the notes and they can get them later on is often helpful. It does not replace their notes, but it's something to help amplify it. And then something that I had honestly learned when I started working at Delaware Valley Friends is that sometimes the computers and the calculators aren't allowed. So if a student has a math disability and they're in a math class in college where they're testing on calculation, that class doesn't have to allow a calculator. Well, what if you have a kid who needs one? You know, they got the accommodation on the SAT. Those are things that require pre-approval. So not just assuming that you can have these devices in your class at all times. And then Mike alluded to earlier in terms of the 504 plans, if there's any kind of medical or physical disability, sometimes there's residential considerations to think about that the disability office can help with. So whether that's a medical single for attentional issues or for asthma, that's something that also needs to come into play in a conversation as your students looking to transition to college. We can move on.
Yeah. So we listed some of our favorite resources here. There are so many more out there, but one of our favorite folks is Elizabeth Hamblett. She's from Columbia. Her website, ldadvisory.com, is a treasure trove of all sorts of things. She just released her book, 7 Steps for Success in College. The second edition came out maybe last year, a year and a half ago. It's really terrific. And then I'll just jump down a couple bullets. So in terms of getting an updated evaluation, we listed some clinics here near local universities. And we're most familiar with universities here in the greater Philadelphia area. But if you're from the greater Pittsburgh area or from central Pennsylvania, I would suggest checking out your local university. And you can put psychological assessment clinic and the university's name, you know, York or Juniata or something like that, to see if one of those colleges has an assessment clinic available. The clinics offer updated evaluations for students, usually on a sliding scale. It takes a little bit of time to get into the queue to be able to get an evaluation, but we found that the evaluations offered by those folks are really affordable and really terrific. In many cases, you know, equally good to the $5,000 evaluation from a private evaluator.
But it depends on what your families are looking for, what they need. There are, like I said, a wealth of opportunities at clinics as well as private ones. Talking about a few other bullet points, collegesupports.com is something that I use frequently. It is a paid subscription, but it's, you know, annual. So I think it's something that families can maybe subscribe to as they're looking ahead, but that actually helps go through the individual offices. So collegesupports.com is a private IEC who has run it and actually interviews. So maybe you've heard of the big giant like K&W LD book. You know, I feel like when things are in print, they're kind of stagnant and they might change. So even in schools that we've been sending students to year after year, new disability coordinators come into play, new programs are in play. I'm finding that more and more schools are adding on add-on programs. I think they're seeing a need for remediation and support across the board nationwide, which is wonderful in my opinion, because it normalizes this experience for our students who learn differently and they can continue to be the advocates and lead that charge. So collegesupports.com is a really great database to help break down various levels, bringing the comprehensive programs that are involved, you know, maybe some residential remediation to spectrum disorders are also listed on there as a separate category. More high levels of support, more just basic accommodations, as well in terms of the database perspective. And The Stressed Years of Our Lives is a book that I really love. I recommend it to a lot of our families. It's not necessarily LD focused, it's general transition, but I think it makes some really great points about what happens when things don't go as planned. And we all know life doesn't go as planned. And how do you build back up from that? How do you support your child? And it's written in a really accessible way that I think non-educator parents can really appreciate. And I think more than ever, we're going to need to support our young people going off to college in this really kind of uncertain world right now. And I really appreciated that. So it's The Stressed Years of Their Lives by Drs. Rothstein and Hibbs. It's on the slide there. And we will also, I have it like across the room from me here. I can hold it up a little later on. Both wonderful books there too. And please reach out to us if you need anything. I think we have some time for some questions. I wish
Yeah,
we
I think
had more
so.
time. But
Yeah.
Are there any questions for the group that we can touch on?
We're welcome to, I mean, I think what our session ends in 2 minutes, but
Yeah.
I can stick around at least for a little
Yeah.
bit if anybody wants to just ask some more questions. You can use the raise my hand feature, or you can use the chat feature, whichever one you prefer.
Or you can unmute yourself too if you really want.
Yeah, or that.
Where can we find the slides? Matt, is there?
Matt?
How do we find our slides, Matt?
If Mike, I'll send you a note to me. If you send it to me, and then what I can do is email it out so everybody has it in this. We have a list of everybody that attended.
There
Awesome.
we go. So,
Great.
and you can also reach out to Mike and I. Our emails were there at the last slides. And we are happy to get on our soapboxes. I think 45 minutes, Mike and I were trying to make this, and our original plan was way longer than 45 minutes because we would love to do this. So I think there's another question about disclosure. So that's a funny topic, is disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike and I joke that, our students are in an interesting position because, they go to our schools. It's disclosed for them, right? You wouldn't go to Delaware Valley Friends or AIM Academy if you didn't learn differently, right? But with that said, we're also very big advocates for disclosure. It could be in the essay, it could be in the additional information, it could just be in a conversation. I think if the student feels passionate that has colored their educational trajectory, it has colored their experience, the essay is a fine place to do that. I think having an honest conversation with our counselor is also very important as well, to be able to make sure we have this rounded narrative about the child's educational path is always important.
Yeah, I would say probably most of our students write about their learning differences in their essay. Occasionally a student will write about it in the additional info section, but most write about it in the essay, and most are writing about it because it's had some sort of profound impact on their educational career. And they do it usually through some sort of story, which I think is very helpful. But I wouldn't say that there's like one size fits all, as usual. But I find that the essay can lend itself to be a little bit more of like a natural way of disclosing. Sometimes the additional comments can sort of feel like, oh, by the way, just know this about me, which isn't necessarily bad if that's how the student would prefer to disclose. But yeah, I think in terms of whether or not to disclose, I typically advocate for students to share as much of their educational experience as they can, so the admissions officer is able to get a full picture of who they are as an individual.
I think there was a question earlier on, I think maybe it was from you, about the June ACT experience. What June ACT experience?
It was bad.
So we actually, so Delaware Valley Friends School, we are not a national test center. We only test our individual students who require school-based testing. We did not do June. We canceled it. However, I am slated to do July for, I think I have half a dozen students registered right now, and I will be glad to talk to you later on. We're going to have face masks and shields and desks and well-ventilated rooms, and it's going to be so much fun, because nothing like taking a 10, 11-hour test in the age of COVID.
Yeah.
I think that's a whole separate session too, is the LD testing pre-COVID is a whole separate session that I'm happy to talk about separately. And then it's the LD testing in times of COVID is, yeah.
I think wrangling the test companies and trying to submit documentation on the behalf, it takes so many resources. It's just crazy. The amount of time that we have to spend trying to support students to get accommodations on standardized exams is sort of wild.
Yeah. I want to add also, I think we're seeing all these test optional announcements, which personally, from like an ethical perspective, I really love. I think another myth that Mike and I didn't touch on is that LD students don't test well. Some of them test very well, right? It's not a universal thing. So this is going to be an important time where more colleges are moving towards a holistic review to really discuss the content they're learning in high school and to know, what high schools that you're dealing with. On the college side, who are the high schools? Who are these students? What are they learning about? How are they learning it? How are they ready to go off to college, to your college in particular? And am I glad that things are more test optional? Absolutely. I think it eliminates so many barriers. It's just an interesting part of how we're all going to broach this next phase of our professional world.
Yeah, we have some students that are terrific testers and some students that are really, really dreadful testers. And sometimes there's like correlation to their learning difference and sometimes not. So I don't see that as, again, being like sort of all LD students are this, all LD students are that. But I do agree that the movement toward test optional will give students more flexibility in saying, I'm pretty good at testing with accommodations, and I can submit my, 1,500 or whatever it might be, which I think is great.
Yeah. Cindy, I want to comment on Cindy's chat right here about LD testing and testing organizations. And Cindy, you are absolutely right. There is way too much on high school counselors' plates. This is something that, Mike and I are very blessed in that we get to focus just on the college counseling piece of things. I know, at least at my school, I'm sure Mike's same way, we work very closely with our school counselors on staff to really create that kind of holistic piece. I do have a background in school counseling as well, so I get to be kind of that de facto extra school counselor, but it is something that I feel it's kind of like a wild, wild west situation where there are so many evaluations out there, and it's the lack of standardization just drives me crazy. And I wish there was a better funnel for this. That's why I think disclosure comes into play. So the earlier a student can have that honest conversation with the disability office at the colleges, the more they can get a handle on what's actually needed for my testing. Is my evaluation report for my district enough? Do I need to go for a private evaluation? What's really going to be necessary? But unfortunately, that's going to fall on the family's shoulders. You can't, do that for them. I wish it was an easier answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, Moravian went test optional. Yay, Moravian.
Good job, Moravian. Just call Pitt.
And Monmouth? Can Monmouth really?
And Monmouth.
I love Monmouth. That's why I call them out. No, that's why I call them out.
Yeah.
Because I love them. That's why. Great. Awesome.
Well, thanks everybody. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I think the next session for PACAC is at 12, I believe, but you can see that on your schedules. And don't forget to fill out your Act 48 and your session evaluations.
Awesome. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Great job, Mike and Haley.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. All right, so Matt, you said that the session will be posted on the
main website. Yeah.
Okay.
So it sounds like every presentation and deck and such are all going to be on there with links for people to click. That's why it's being recorded right now. If you want, you can email that to me just in case, and then I can make sure that it's on there. My email is simple. It's just matt.hale@revolutionprep.com. As a
Can we
backup.
just chat it over to you?
Sure.
Okay, I've got the Google whatever open.
The Google slide.
Let me make it public and I'll chat it over to you. Hold on just a second.
We were also just testing you all because it's Monday morning. That's why we canceled it right away to bring you back in to like kind of break the ice a little bit. That's how we do things here.
Share. I can also just add the Google slide. I can just add Matt to that if that's helpful too.
Yeah.
Instead of sending it over. So what was it? It was
Matt.Hale
at
revolutionprep.com.
Yes. All right. Great. You should be on the Google Slides now, so you can export it as you see fit.
Sweet.
Haley, I just got your email. Where did it go?
I was like furiously emailing Mike.
I wish you could see our Slack channel. All of us were doing the same thing because when it happened, I thought it was me. And I was like, I don't even have my hand on the mouse. Like, what just happened?
Yeah.
But it was everybody. But good job. That was great. Thank you for that.
That was cool. We packed in a ton of information in a very short amount of time. I think we only ended up with like 35 minutes of talk time. So, but it was
tough.
A nice turn.
They didn't really have. I feel like sometimes we do this in person. People have more questions about I don't know if people are just zoomed out of their path. I don't know. I'd love to know from other presenters but I feel like, I don't know, when we do this in person, we get more questions.
We always get more questions about documentation. It's like all I spend my time talking about. But I think we did a pretty good job of laying out, like, here's what you need and like here's the things that you can expect.
And I used to get questions about like the SATs and the ACTs. Like, tell me more about accommodations. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, it's pretty standard.
What was it? It was like 24 people, I think, maximum at one point. Or is other not counting
max
us?
was I guess, yeah. Not counting us.
Yeah, because it was 27.
Yep.
Yeah.
So like
Okay.
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, I think I saw there was, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, there's 9 other rooms. So I think, there's about 400 people in the conference. So, I mean, that's a good turnout.
Do you know, I'm just completely nosy. Do you know how many people were in the other sessions?
I don't.
You can't see that?
No. Yeah, I don't have that access.
I want to know.
Just in your head, you're number 1, okay? So
I'm not fooling us. It's okay.
Yeah.
Right. Mike and I know the other ones. We are well aware that.
Well, that was good. I mean, you guys were just with a handful, so you had well over 20.
That was good.
That was nice.
Awesome. There's some new faces too. I didn't know all the ones there. So.
Yeah, it's some interesting people that I had never even seen before. So that's very cool.
Some young counselors. It's tough without their cameras on to know kind of who's
Yeah,
a young counselor.
That was strange. That was more people not on camera than I'm used to. Usually everybody for these conferences, there'll be like 2 or 3, but there's quite a few that weren't on camera. But you guys weren't the only ones, because somebody else said it on our channel. I was like, wow, there's a lot of people not showing face, because usually for these conferences you're going to be in person anyways, so you might as well interact this way. Where was yours supposed to be at, do you know?
Seven Springs.
Okay.
Yeah. I think people I don't know how many people would register to go to Seven Springs. Might be more people in the virtual conference.
Maybe. I feel like Seven Springs is always slightly smaller because it's so far away, but it's a nicer place than like
Hershey.
Go to Hershey. Yeah.
Smells
Hershey.
like chocolate everywhere. Do you think they pump
biggest
the
hotel
chocolate
ever?
Smell into?
They do.
Yeah.
All I know is I get lost in that hotel.
I was just gonna say, I think I got lost in the hotel.
I'm always late for everything there because it's the longest, craziest building, and I get so lost.
Yikes.
Alrighty. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your help.
Thanks,
Mike, it's always a pleasure working with you.
Likewise.
You guys have a great day.
Thanks.
Good work. Thanks.
All right.
Take care.